Greetings, everyone. Jim Walker here. Welcome to my YouTube channel. Welcome back if you are a return viewer. Always glad to have people checking out the channel. Today's topic, I'll do a quick one because my batteries are starting to go on the camera. Six-lug snare drums. As I started to put together my plans to start sharing videos on YouTube, my list, this was one of the first ones that went up there because I'm a fan of a good six-lug snare drum. The qualifier in there, a good one. Uh, there are a lot of drummers who seem to have a bias, which I understand. I'll get into that in a minute. They will not even consider a six-lug snare drum. They talk about their snare drums. It's 8 versus 10. I like 10 because X. I like 8 because Y. And six-lug snare drums don't enter the equation at all. And I've got all three in my stable arsenal, whatever term you want to use, of snare drums. 6, 8, and 10. I'm talking 14-inch size right now. Obviously, like a 10-inch popcorn snare is most likely going to be a six-lugger. But I'm talking about a standard 14-inch primary snare drum. And I understand the bias because for a lot of drummers, their experience with six-lug snare drums is probably very specific, and it's probably a drum like this. This is, what's the brand on this one? WJM, which I don't mean to single out that brand. There are many brands, many companies that make a drum like this. It's an entry-level drum. It's designed for someone who's just starting out, someone who doesn't want to invest, or their parents don't want to invest a ton of money. They want to, because I can tell you this as a drum teacher with a lot of young students, it's very common for students to start with drums and then just lose interest. And they just go on to the next thing, and then they try guitar and they lose interest, and then they go do soccer and they lose interest. It's kind of par for the course for that age, which is great. You can explore some different things. But if you have someone who's just starting out, you're a parent, and your son or daughter is interested in drums, and they start out on the pad and they stay with it, and it's time to get them a snare drum. They've shown their interest. You're probably not going to run out and get them a Gladstone or a Donette or a Craviotto because that's a lot of coin to sink into someone who's just starting out. So a drum like this is designed to cost as little as possible, and it shows in the materials. Of all the components of a drum set, at least in terms of the drums, the tom-toms, bass drum, snare drum, it's the snare drum that is most likely to show any evidence of corners being cut, materials being gone through a lesser expensive option than any other part of the kit, because there's so many more moving parts on this one, for lack of a better expression. Every drum's got the hoops, the shell, the heads, the lugs. Snare drum, we've got the snare beds, we've got the snare mechanism, the snare wires, and it just, it will, if there's corner that has been cut, more likely to be shown here. And that, in my not so humble opinion, is why a six-lug snare drum like this one leaves such a bad memory for so many other drummers. And they tend to think that's their only exposure with a six-lugger. That defines this category, and from there on out, they want nothing to do with it. Now, this video is not designed to convince anyone that they should be interested or should like a six-lug snare drum. I've long ago given up on any pretense of ever convincing someone that they should like something, whether it's drums or any other topic, because it just doesn't work. All I can do is share what I like, and maybe if you are one of these individuals who will just dismiss six-lug snare drums out of hand, you might be missing a really good drum somewhere. And maybe this video will cause you at least consider the option. Doesn't mean you have to like it. I like six-lug snare drums. This one is actually a drum that belongs to the community music school where I teach. The drums that we use for in-person teaching, which we are slowly transitioning back to, and here in April of 2021. We got a nice Slingerland 70s, 80s wood snare drum that we use. So this is something, there was a drum set that was donated by a family, as I understand it. Same brand, entry-level stuff. their son, their daughter, I can't remember which, it was before I started teaching there, lost interest. Parents had this drum set. It wasn't worth selling, didn't have any real market value. It was a shame to throw it out, so they gave it to the school. And occasionally we'll have a reason to use it for something, but they rather usually sit around gathering dust. And this is the snare drum that came with it. And it's the basic, generic, mass-produced, thin steel shell with cheap lugs. I don't know if they're actually pot metal, but that's the term people use. And it's okay. You can see somewhere we've gotten the bent wire on here. I don't know if that's going to show up at all. I hope I didn't just do that. I don't remember that being there. But generic wires, thin shell. Yeah, if you're a drummer, you know these. You probably played one at some point. The hoops aren't that anything special. I tried putting some different heads on it. I've at least got rid of the stock heads that are on it. Evans head on it and on top, and tack head on the bottom, and that helps, but it is what it is. Oh, it's functional, it's great for entry-level stuff, but when I do move this operation downstairs at the conclusion of this portion of taping and do some sound files, I don't think I'm even going to bother with this one. You know what this one is about. But back around 2003, 2004, when I first got into the drum building, drum refurbishing thing, got the bug, the first thing I did was I picked up what turned out to be a wooden Ludwig Pioneer shell on eBay and had some parts, so I built it up, and it was really nice. And I've long since sold it. It just wasn't getting used. But that left a really favorable impression in my mind of what a six-lug snare drum could be. So as time went on, I started getting into building. Never got to the point where I was making my own shells. Who knows? Maybe that'll happen someday. It hasn't happened yet. But I'll purchase the shell, get the parts, and do the edges, do the finishing, take it from there. One of the things on my to-do list was to try making a really nice six-lug snare drum. Because a lot of the great drums from the 1920s and 1930s, old great brass Ludwigs, 6 lugs. There are even 15-inch brass snare drums from the 30s and 20s that have 6 lugs on them. So, and those get used a lot in studio. Guys love having them. So, at a certain point, taking part in the drum forum geared towards hobbyists and independent drum builders, a place called ghostnote.net, found one company called Vaughncraft that was producing shells. They've since gone by the wayside. It's another story for another time. But at one point they put up a bunch of shells for sale that were, they call them seconds. I have 2 shells from them that were seconds. I've yet to figure out, in 15 years, I've yet to figure out what was wrong with them that caused them to go on the seconds pile. Sound great to me. And this is one of them. So I picked this up, the 4.5 by 14 maple shell. I'm probably just going to get reflections on here. I'll hold it up just in case you can see the inside. But 4.5 by 14 maple shell, single ply, steam bent, reinforcement rings. And I picked it up before I knew exactly what I wanted to do with it. And I thought this might be a good candidate for my 6-lug experiment. And finally worked up the nerve to commit to it. And turned out this drum is great. And this, I think, supports my hypothesis that a 6-lug snare drum can sound really good if the workmanship is really good and the components are really high quality. We got a great maple steam bent shell. Nice. I'm not sure if they're steel or brass. Single flange hoops. Nice heads. Dynamics or Dynamic X snare wires. I'm never sure how to pronounce that. Lovely wires. Boy, I wish they were in production. My favorite snare wires ever. Nice strainer. Edges. Very round. I think the term, in modern day parlance, they're called baseball bat edges. I hope I'm not violating some sort of trademark by referencing that, but very round. Rounded in or rounded outer. I wanted specifically to go more for a vintage approach on this in terms of the edges. And I love this drum. This one I'm definitely going to record when we head downstairs in a couple of minutes. I've used it on drum set for my symphony gigs, for Pops concerts. Great drum. I got a couple of other six luggers I want to mention, but let me take a second before my battery gives out and talk about what I think are the reasons why I like these Six-Lug snare drums. Not to the exclusions of 8 and 10s. If I could only have one drum, I'm not sure it would be a six-lugger, although this one we'll get to in a minute is the exception that I think is proving the rule. But a couple of reasons. The outer diameter of the shell, which is actually slightly undersized. Nowadays shells are, a 14-inch shell by name is actually about 13 7/8 inches outer diameter. Allows the heads to see it out a little bit more nicely. We'll get back to that with this drum. But the outer diameter, I know this from measuring and doing layouts for drilling for hardware, around 110, 111 centimeters. And yes, I know we have an American using the metric system. If you need to pause the tape and collect yourself, I'll understand completely. But simple math. If we have 10 lugs on a snare drum, then each lug is, if it's 110 centimeters, 11 or so, 11.1, whatever, centimeters apart. I'm not worried about the exact numbers. 8 lugs, more distance between each lug and thus between each tension rod. 6 lugs, even more distance. Why does that matter? Because on metal hoops, die cast not so much, they don't have as much flex, but a single flanged hoop, triple flanged hoop, there is a little bit of flex in the hoop. So we've got points of tension where these claws, the tension rods, are pulling down on the head. Pull down on a counter hoop, and this in turn pulling down on a flesh hoop, which stretches the head, which causes the change in pitch as we tune the drum up or down. In between, there's a little bit of flex, so the tension pulling down on the head here, halfway between these two tension rods, is not as great as it is at the tension rods. So there's a little bit of variance in tension, which means there's a little bit of variance in pitch, which means the sound of a six-lugger is not going to be as clean and pure, for lack of a better term, as, say, a 10-lug snare drum. And now we're getting into musical taste and personal taste and what sound you want. I like the fact that this isn't as pristine a tuning. It adds a certain warmth, a certain thickness to the sound that I like having as an option. The other advantage to having a lesser number of lugs is whatever tension is required to get the head to a certain pitch, however many pounds. I'm afraid I don't have any of the modern day gadgets, so I can't tell you a drum dial reading or anything like that. I don't have that with me. So this is tuned to, like it matters at this point, medium tension, medium high. If I were to go really low with the tensioning on this, the greater the number of lugs, the less tension per lug. It's distributed, same amount of tension is distributed among more lugs, less tension on each lug. So with a lower tuning, the tension rod is more likely to back out. 6-lugger, more tension on each individual tension rod at each individual lug, not as likely to back out at lower tunings. So I don't use lower tunings all the time, but I like that option. So it's good to have for that. I've never had, I don't usually go for the screaming Stuart Copeland or reggae style of snare drum tuning where things are way up in the stratosphere. If I wanted that, probably wouldn't use a 6, but I've never had trouble getting a 6-lug drum tuned high enough for my purposes. So I think that's my limited understanding of the mechanics of it. Danny Farrington can tell you how many pounds there are of pressure on an acoustic guitar when it's all strung up. I'm sure there's a number for how much pressure, how many pounds of pressure are exerted on a drum head if you tune it around an A. I don't have that number. I've never investigated to that degree. But whatever the exact numbers, those are the tendencies, and I think that's a mechanical explanation of what I like. All I know is if it's a good drum, if it's got 6 lugs, I like it. And that's kind of as far as I take things nowadays. If I like it, I like it. If it Duke Ellington, if it sounds good, it is good. So as you can see by the rickety edit we just had, battery died. So just to finish up my thoughts here, that's a good indication that I'm talking too long on this one. 3 6-luggers I've got in my collection. I'm going to go downstairs, take the camera downstairs, set up my microphones, and make some sound files. Already talked about the 4.5 by 14 steam bent maple, the Von Craft shell. This one, 5 by 14, it's a 10-ply Keller maple shell. It has sharper edges than this one. Nickel strainer, which has yet to give up the ghost on me. It's on my to-do list. I had parts left over in the shell, which is going nowhere, so I decided just to build it up. I had the nickel strainer. Got some very cheap lugs here. And you can see this, I don't know if the lug splay is showing up. I got to get some gaskets for it, but it turned out really well. I kind of made it just for the sake of making. I call it one of my casserole builds. I just kind of use up some leftover parts. These hoops here originally were on this drum. This shell, I actually just got it completed this weekend. It had been sitting on, the raw shell had been sitting on the shelf, unadorned, unwanted, unused, not unwanted because I still had it. To the best of my knowledge, when I got this shell, it was actually sold to me as an aluminum shell. I bought it on eBay, and it was just slathered in really bad, thick silver paint. The seller thought it was aluminum. As you can see from this, cleaned it up, it turned out to be brass. And to the best of my research, I believe this shell is a 1920s or 30s Leedy Reliance. I've also had people online suggest to me that it's a Wurlitzer shell. Wurlitzer made by Leedy, apparently. I'm not a huge vintage aficionado. Maybe someone will chime into the comments down below and enlighten me a little bit. But this one didn't get a whole lot of use for a while. I think when I realized it was a 20s or 30s brass shell, there's got to be some goodness in there. So that's why I never gave up on it. But I realized there were two things that were causing the results to be poor. Because I put the drum together, it was choked, it was muffled, no tone, no tuning range. Two things that fixed that. Let me clear this out of the way. I know I'm burning up time here on the internet, but that's all right. Two things. One, now was it 5 years ago, 4 years ago, a couple of the drumhead companies, a couple of the manufacturers started making drum heads designed to accommodate vintage drums with flesh hoops. They're just a little bit different design, able to accommodate the full 14-inch shell that a drum like this has versus the 3 7/8 diameter shell diameter shell that I mentioned earlier. Regular heads just don't fit well on this one. I was trying to use a standard mylar head. It just would not tune up that well. Also, the black, I just put it down, I could have left it up here. The black hoops that are on the purple drum, the Keller shell, 2.3 millimeter. Just heavy enough, it choked between that and the heads, choked off the drum. So I've got a head on here that is designed to fit the wider diameter of the shell. 1.6 millimeter hoops, open things up, and a couple of days into it, I'm extraordinarily happy with the results on this one. As you can see, this is not a vintage strainer on this, so my apologies to the vintage aficionados out there. When I got this shell, the finish had already been messed up. There were already some extra holes in it, so I decided let's go ahead. It's a player shell already, and I put a Gibraltar strainer. Not vintage, but kind of fits, I think, the flavor of the drum. The look is okay for this. It's not a trick strainer or anything, which just wouldn't look right on this drum. So very happy with the results. So this will be another one that I record downstairs. So with that, I will wrap things up for this segment, relocate, set up the microphones, do some recording, and show you what some of these drums sound like.